Hello everyone, and welcome to video 5 in the series of PowerApps and BPM using Microsoft Flow. If you haven't watched the previous videos, it might be a good idea to do so. We'll pop a link in YouTube around about now. It might be a good idea to just give you some background as to what it is that we're busy with, and just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Right, so today we're going to be discussing the data sources, and the data sources are pretty much split into two. First of all, what are we busy workflow enabling? And typically in the example of staff onboarding that we're busy with, you'll see that all of this information relates to what it is that we're sending through the process. So staff onboarding, you'll typically have job title, motivation, employment type, requested start date, first name, last name, and so on and so forth. And this information describes the data or the form. If we have an example of a leave request, you'll have employee, leave type, leave from, leave to, reason for leave, and these sort of things. So if you forget about the fact that we're going to put this data through a business process, and if this was a simple Power App to just capture the data, this table would look exactly the same. In this table, we do, however, not contaminate any of the data with process-related things. So we try not to have things like date created or date submitted or these sort of things in the data table, because that belongs in the process table. So second table or data source we're gonna look at is then actually the transaction log or the history, and you will typically have information split into two. The first set of information is submitted by PowerApps. So as soon as the user selects an option in the workflow step and hits submit, we'll capture things like the submission date, what process it is that we're busy referring to, what is the data record ID that is being submitted, the person, the process stage, the process step name, selected option, and then any comments that the user might have had during that time. That is then submitted by PowerApps, and that gives Flow the instruction to execute the BPM. And Flow will then go and do a string of things in order to make that BPM submission happen, and it'll then determine what is the destination step, the name of the destination step, the responsible role, the responsible person, which might be based on certain rule sets for that role, and then typically whether it's processed, so we need Flow to confirm that it has actually processed that submission, as well as, is it completed. So is completed is not really important. It's you could do it in other ways as well, but we'll use that as an example. Other ideas that you can actually submit into the transaction log, the history as well, is things like event stamps. So instead of having dates in the data table, you might want to have things like date created, date approved, date submitted, date cancelled, these sort of things in the workflow history table, which you'll then use to report on using Power BI or whatever tools you want to use. Another idea for that is typically things like SLA duration. What is the expected time that we wanted this thing to be in this step, and how long did it actually take in that step? More ideas are things like man hours taken. So as soon as somebody hits submit in PowerApps, you can ask them how much time they spent on this, and this could then automatically populate timesheets and these sort of things. Moving into SharePoint, we can now look at the SharePoint list that we used for the staff onboarding Power App during the previous videos. And this list only talks to the information that's stored in the form. And this information is being sent through a workflow process, but the information in this list only talks about the form, and none of it talks about the process. The process we try and keep outside of this data as far as possible. So in the example of the staff onboarding, we'll have job title, first name, last name, department, motivation, experience required, these sort of information, but none of this should have any workflow history or any responsibility built into it. So things like status, approved by, approved date, as far as possible keep this information out of this SharePoint list or data source. Again, this is a SharePoint list, although this might as well be in SQL. It really doesn't matter from a BPM perspective. You also don't have to have your data and your workflow list in the same, or data sources in the same type of data source. So you can have your data in a SharePoint list and then have your workflow history in SQL. It really doesn't matter which you choose. Flow in the backend takes care of all of those difficult things for you. We're now looking at the transaction log or history list or data source, and in this instance it is SharePoint, although it's most probably better suited in SQL, especially because this data source might accumulate a lot of data very quickly. And in this example we'll see that there are 3 history entries, and these all relate to record 60, which is the example we used in PowerApps earlier. And you'll see that these keep track of the different steps that record 60 went through. And the first few columns are written by PowerApps as soon as the user clicks on submit. So submission date, process key. A process key is very important because it needs to keep track of which process executed this transaction, especially if you're going to use a central workflow history list or table for different processes, and not create a workflow history for leave and another workflow history table for purchase requisitions and another one for staff onboarding and so on and so forth. If you keep them centralized, you definitely need the process key as well as the record ID in order to determine and tell Flow, well, and the data source, which data record is being submitted as part of this workflow history entry. So as I was saying, PowerApps, as soon as the user selects the option and clicks on submit, PowerApps would go and write the submission date, the process key, record ID, who the person is to actually click submit, what the stage in the process is, what the step in the process is, and what the name of that step is, as well as the option that the user have selected at that time, combined with any comments that they might have had at the time of clicking on submit. And a combination of all of this information then kicks off Flow in order to check the routing logic and understand, based on a set of business rules and whatever you want to define in Flow, based on that, this should go to the relevant next step. And then also reading the JSON information in that we've profiled previously to understand what is the name of that step, what is the responsible role, who's the responsible person, and then we need confirmation from Flow to say that it's finished with this specific transaction or the specific entry in the workflow history. So essentially this table, like I said, works well if you consolidate it, and so that might generate a lot of traffic, and that's very important to keep in mind when choosing your data source. So typically this will work better in SQL, although for smaller environments you can easily use SharePoint for this as well. We've now opened up the Power App that we created in the previous video, and this Power App is connected to the connection that uses the custom connector that we created using the Postman collection that is extracting the information from the JSON business profile that we saved in Flow. Alright, so that's quite a mouthful, but if I have a look at this button, just to quickly refresh our memories, we've got 2 clear collect statements. The first one populates the awesome workflow manager workflow collection by calling that connection and actioning the fetch flow BPM profile action from the custom connector, and then passing it the onboarding string in order to tell Flow which JSON profile it is that we're looking for. We're then taking that collection and ungrouping it on the process steps column, and we're using the result of that to populate the workflow steps collection. And to prove to you that it works, I'm just going to click on this button. we'll see the running ants at the top of the screen, and then all of the controls that we created previously now all of a sudden comes to life. Alright, so that's pretty cool, and it's also quite amazing how fast that runs. I'm very impressed with the speed at which all of these things trigger. So again, Flow and PowerApps themes, kudos, absolutely hats off. Alright, so what we're going to be doing now is to actually simulate creating a record into the data list, and there are a couple of ways of doing this, and the guys who've been working with PowerApps for a while would understand the difference between using a form and using a patch statement or patch function. And by using the patch function, you have a lot more control over the data that you're sending and validation and these sort of things. So to keep this very simple, I'm going to use the patch function, although this is also possible using forms. So what we're going to do is basically, let's move these things, and you might ask why I'm selecting those things and it's having a pop-up every time. It's basically because I'm on a Mac and some of the shortcuts don't work similar to how they do in Windows. So first thing I'm going to do is insert a gallery. So let's do a blank gallery, and we can make it small. We don't need this much space at this stage. So that should do. And in here we're just going to connect it to, I think we call it to onboarding flow. So if I open up the data sources, you'll see that we connected to the two SharePoint lists that we showed just a second ago as well. So we're going to connect this to that data source, and if we go into the data to display, we're just going to add a title for now, and we're going to specify the title column. Alright, so basically there's the information that's currently in that SharePoint list. And now in order to create a new record in that SharePoint list, there are a few things that we'll have to do. First, let's go and create a new screen that we'll be using for the data, and we can call that screen data. And now we can go and insert a label just so that we know what we're working with, and we're going to call that job title. And we're also going to insert a text input, so it allows us to specify a job title. We can just remove the default value for now. And to keep things interesting, let's also add a motivation label as well as a text input for the motivation. So don't worry about too much about the styling. I'm sure there's a lot of people going right now. That's fine. We're not going to focus on that too much. What we're all going to focus on is to name these things properly so we know what it is that we're calling. So over here, let's call that title value and motivation value. Alright, so these are the two fields that we essentially want to populate into the data source. We can now also go to our first screen and just use this radio button that we used as an example, and maybe also just that label. So let's cut that and just paste it on here and move it to the side, and then we're going to use this to tell us what is the status and what are the workflow options that we currently have for the record that we have selected. Alright, so this data screen at the moment doesn't have any context to the workflow or the business process, so we need to set it up every time we call it. So we need to set up this form with the information that it needs to know how to behave. So we need to tell that screen more about the relevant step in the process before we call it. So remember that we have this button that has the workflow collections already. So we can now, at the time of calling that screen to create a new record, we can tell it that screen to listen to, or to actually use that information from the JSON object in order to know what information should be displayed and how to behave. So to do that, we're going to use this formula, and to run through this quickly, first of all, we're setting a variable to tell that screen that it should be in edit mode. Because it's a new record, it just makes sense that way. Second of all, we're going to set a variable to tell it that it's a new one. We're then also setting a form underscore record variable to blank, and you'll see where that comes into play a little bit later. And then we're saying that at this stage we're not allowing the administration override function, which basically overrides access control or hidden fields or locked fields or these sort of things. And because it's a new record, it doesn't make sense to have an admin override. What we're then doing is we're setting the current record step ID, and we're doing that by just going into the workflow steps collection and finding the first record and then fetching the step ID. Secondly, we're then populating the current record step collection with all of the details around that step, and we're then doing it, we're filtering this steps collection by using the ID we got in the previous line. And that might seem like a long way around, but we're doing it like that so we can keep the formula uniform, so when we start calling existing records, then you can use a similar formula. Then thirdly, we're now creating the current record options collection by ungrouping the current record step on the step options column. And we're then setting a current record step name, just a variable just to make it easy to access, and then we're also setting the responsible person to the current user. Now over here you can also declare the current user variable on start, and then just use that variable name in this line over here. It makes no difference really. But essentially, if we now preview this and we click on plus, you'll see that it opens up the screen. It's lightning fast, and if we're now going to have a look at the collections, you'll see the various collections that we've set up. The first one is the workflow, and that contains the entire workflow object. Second one is workflow steps, and both of these first two have been created by the onStart formula, or in our case the button that we created to generate this information. So we then have the current record step, and that only has the information about the current step that we've set up at the time of clicking the plus or add button. And here you'll see all of the information, the responsible role, the instructions, what options should be available, what fields should be available, editable as well as mandatory. You'll also see that the current record options collection just talks about the options that should be available to the user in this particular workflow step. And we can now go ahead, and the fields are blank because it's a new form, which is fine. And if we have a look at this, currently it's doing a lookup to the workflow steps and all of that, so we actually don't need to do that anymore because we now have the current record step, and we can just go and fetch the step name. So it might be, sorry, it might see that as an array, so there we go. And now it'll find the current record step, which will always only be one record, but PowerApps doesn't necessarily know that, so we're telling it just fetch the first one and then find the step name in that request. And then on the step options, we're now basically saying that it should just display the value of the current record options, and you'll see there it says submit request. Alright, so that's how we now interact with that JSON, and this will now automatically update as we submit other records in different workflow steps as well. And you'll see that we use the same screen for both visible or read only or read mode and edit mode forms, so you don't need to create multiple screens for that even. So we would now need a way for the user to submit or to save this data, and ultimately we want to save these fields into the data list, and then we want to submit the instruction into the workflow history or the workflow transaction log list. So for now, let's go and create an icon that's basically tells the user that it's going to submit it. So let's basically just maybe have a next. It just says that this is going to submit it. Let's add it to the bottom there maybe. And on the first option, or the first part of this, we simply just need to submit the data. And there are a couple of things that you can do before that. So you might check certain validations or business rules before you allow the submission. But let's pass all of those and say we basically are gonna submit, do a patch to the onboarding flow data source. We're passing it a blank ID to tell it that it's a new record, and we're telling it that the title column should be populated with the information from the title underscore value dot text. And this is also very important to keep these controls uniform, the naming convention, so it's very easy to populate formulas like this, especially if you start having 100 fields on a form, which could easily happen. So this patch then runs, and the result of that patch is a reference to the new record that was created. And we then take that result or that reference and we save that into the form underscore record variable, and then it's very easy to interact with that record in the future. Right, so we've got two fields. We don't only have one, so we can go and specify that we'd like the motivation value or column to be the motivation underscore value control, and get the text property from that control, and that'll now essentially save the data into that SharePoint list. So in addition to saving the data, we also want to save the workflow history, and the saving of the workflow history also then acts as an instruction for Flow to trigger the submission flow and do what it needs to do. So we again going to run a patch, and we're then going to pass it a blank ID again to tell the patch command that it's a new record that it should create. There should be no reason to update an existing workflow history, so most of the time it'll be a new one. Pass it the current date. You can have the date add function accommodate for time zones if that's necessary. We're then also passing the ID that it's getting from the form underscore record variable that we got from the previous patch command where we saved the data. And we're saving that into the record ID column, and that's what links the workflow history to the actual data. We're then passing it the process key. Typically you'll declare the process key on the on start, and then it's easy to just use that variable over here. Similar to the user, you could have a variable on start and then just pass it that variable name over here. Then we need to tell it what is the current process stage, and then it's going to connect to the current record step and fetch the process stage. Same for the step ID and the step name, but the step name we've actually declared into a variable previously, or set into a variable previously, so it's easier to access. Then we need to tell it which option the user had selected at the time of clicking the submit button. So we're going to replace that with the name of our radio button. This is radio 4, and we say the selected record or selected value, and then fetch the option name from that. So the two-step name, everything that relates to the destination step won't be known to PowerApps at this stage, because that's Flow's job. We want Flow to connect to the different data sources, go and check who is the next relevant responsible person, next relevant step, all of these sort of things. So these things we simply pass as blank, and then we have a step comment where you could have a comment field to force the user or to ask the user for comments at the time of submitting. Right, so this patch command would then now also write the workflow history, and let's go and test. So I've opened up the SharePoint list again, and as you can see, staff onboarding flow only has the cook entry, and if we go to the history, we have the 3 history entries that all relate to record 60. So if I go into my app, let's go and preview this, and we're now looking for a pilot. and the motivation is tired of driving. And what do we want to do? We want to submit the request. Okay, all of that looks good. And now we click on the submit button. So at this stage, we haven't made this return anything or navigate to a different screen. So all that we wanted that to do is to update the SharePoint list. So let's go and have a look. There's record ID 61, and this is the history. So let's go first to look at the data. So there's my pilot request. So that's saved successfully. And if we have a look at the second list, we'll see a workflow history that was written for record ID 61. And here's all of the information that it fetched from JSON at the runtime. And essentially you'll see that all of the destination fields are blank, as Flow now needs to kick in and submit this process. So that concludes our video for today. Thank you again for watching, and thank you for all of the great comments and feedback that you've been sending us. It's really appreciated, and please keep them coming. The next video we'll be discussing the flow that actually does the submission, and I know there's quite a few guys that are waiting for that and that have been asking for that, so we're jumping into that next. And then we'd also like to remind you that if you would like to be part of the team that makes suggestions as to what goes into this BPM template that we're planning to release to the community, please get in contact with me. My contact details are on the screen at the moment. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye bye.